2023 East Valley Command Training. Today, we're going to be discussing a number of things. Today, we'll be discussing response to large house fires. This is a topic that was discussed here and presented here in the fourth quarter of 2023 in our East Valley Command Training. This subject is one we've been looking at for a while as one of the presentation topics. And then there was a couple of incidents that occurred nationwide with some fatalities, as well as some local events that occurred, which moved it to the top of our list for presentation. So as we start talking about response to large residential structures, it's much different than just the bread and butter residential fires that we typically respond to. When we talk about large residential structures, we're typically talking about a home that's larger than 3,500 square feet. And that can go up to as much as 20,000 square feet or larger, obviously, but anything over 3,500 square feet, we consider to be a pretty large home. They can be 1 or 2 stories. Some may have a basement. They often have very complex floor plans, heavy fire loads, numerous void spaces. They're very challenging incidents to respond to. And they can even be very challenging, obviously, even for our most capable incident commanders. But we need to understand that fires in large homes are not common, making them high-risk, low-frequency events. So why are we reviewing large house fires? Well, because big houses burn. It's one of the things, obviously, and then when they do burn, they're very dangerous to our firefighters, and the outcomes are obviously, in a lot of situations, not very good. You can see a couple of examples of some large homes that are burned in from a national perspective, but you can see, obviously, they're not going very well here, and it's probably not the result of improper tactics as much as just some of the challenges associated with these large homes. So this is one of the events that occurred here locally that got us moving on to discussing some of these large residential home fires. This is an incident that occurred at a short-term rental in Scottsdale here, but in talking to the incident commanders, they discussed a lot of the challenges that we're going to be reviewing today here as far as being able to put out some of these massive home fires that we have and they may have in your jurisdiction as well. Here's another incident that occurred a little while back in Chandler. You can see here, this is a giant 12,000 square foot home, 2-story home with a basement. You can see, I think they had 6 or 7 fireplaces here, just a huge home here. Crews got on the scene here relatively quickly. They weren't inside the structure for a very long time. I think that within 7 minutes of arrival on the scene, they had fire through the roof and they went defensive within 27 minutes here. And this is a 12,000 square foot home here. And I know they had a number of challenges associated with this, hidden void space fires and other things that created problems for them. So as we started conducting our research, we found that there's basically what I could see to be 15 challenges that were different for large house fires versus just either our standard residential structures or some of our commercial structures. And I'll briefly go through these because we're going to go through them individually in here in just a few minutes. But construction, some of the setbacks and access challenges, difficulty obtaining a 360, security forcible entry challenges, configuration, unique floor plans, some high ceilings, some of the issues that would be associated with high ceilings, huge attics and buildovers, the 150-foot interior depth limitation, excess fire loading basements, the mentality of just discussing the mentality of large versus small residential structure fires, difficulty conducting a search, complex roofs and ventilation, air management, and visual acuity from the incident commander's perspective are some of the challenges that we identified as we worked through some of the previous incidents that occurred as we reviewed some of the line of duty death reports throughout the nation here. As I read articles and other things, this is some of the basically the differences that were specific to large residential structure fires. So number 1, construction. One of the first things we find is there's a lot of lumber involved in these things. So these structures, when you have a significant amount of money to build when you're to build a new home, some of these folks have no expenses spared here. They will overbuild some of these structures here from the standpoint of most of them will be built by 2x6 minimums. They use OSB and plywood and other things, which are much greater than what we have with our typical standard tract home residential construction. So we find, and that's both good and bad. It's good from the perspective of it allows our homes to be more structurally sound here as we fight fires in these structures, but it also creates more challenges for us because of some of the buildovers, because of the way they're built and with the amount of lumber and other features that are involved. It makes it much more difficult for us to gain access into some of these hidden void spaces and other challenges that we may encounter. There's also, you may encounter some of the non-traditional stuff. Once again, when people have a lot of money to spend, sometimes they like to do things a little different. So you might find homes made with metal studs, foam blocks, which are some of the environmentally conscious folks. And from a energy perspective, energy savings perspective, sometimes you may see something like these foam blocks. You may see 3D printing. I saw some of this taking place back east here in some articles that I read here, some 3D printing. And then you may find some block construction. You don't see as much of that. I think it's basically cost prohibitive in certain areas and at certain times here, depending on the economy and other things here. But you may see some block construction, but primarily most of the stuff we're seeing is lightweight wood frame construction. Finishes can be anything. You may see stone surfaces, brick veneers, block, vinyl surfaces, stucco, wood siding, combination of all the above. So you can expect just about anything when you respond out to these structures here. So it's really not really predictable as to what you may encounter here. It's obviously just depends on the homeowner's preferences as far as some of their exterior finishes. And some of these can have different challenges associated with them as well. Obviously, block construction may be much more structurally sound, but it also maintains heat on the interior of the structure much more than some of the other types of construction. Some of the wood siding and other things may lead to quick fire spread and other things like that. So exterior finishes may come into play when we start talking about large residential home fires. Setbacks, access and challenges associated with apparatus placement. When we start talking about large homes, and once again, we start looking, most of these large homes are obviously going to be on large lots. But some of the things we see as we start looking at large homes, we start talking about setbacks of a minimum of 30 feet. In most situations, or a lot of situations, they're probably 50 feet, and in some situations, 200 or more feet. So obviously that creates some challenges for us as we start talking about hose line deployment and access from our apparatus perspective. You can pretty much so figure big homes, big lots, big setbacks is what you would expect anytime we're responding to large residential structure fires. You can expect long, narrow, circular driveways with soft shoulders. Also, we typically do not park, as you can see here in the lower picture here. We rarely park on circular driveways and other things as we make entry into some of our structures. So, but if we do, we may find challenges associated with those narrow driveways and soft shoulders. Aerial access probably going to be limited. We find challenges when we have this big a setback. It may be difficult for us, obviously, to work off an aerial as far as vertical ventilation. We may have access for some aerial operations as far as elevated master streams and things of that nature. But in a lot of these situations, we're probably going to only have access to one side. Unless it's on a corner, we typically do not have a 360-degree access to these large residential structures. So our aerial access may be compromised. Gated entries and courtyards may cause additional delays, and you can see some of them here. You can see that in some of these structures, the upper right-hand corner, you got some gated access, which may have difficulty even getting near the structure. In other situations, you may have some of these courtyards with security doors getting into the courtyard, which means that our folks are going to have difficulty not only getting through the courtyard gate access, but then we have to gain access to the main residential doorway itself. And all those may result in additional delays and additional challenges for our firefighters. You can also see some of the setbacks. This is a driveway going to a house in the North Mesa here. That's probably at least a 200-foot driveway that serves a group home that has 10 elderly residents that are disabled residents, and it's probably about an 8,000 or 9,000 square foot home. Once again, that you can't even see from the road, and with a significant setback and a narrow driveway, which limits our access, obviously, if we have to respond to an incident at this location. Some of the locations, obviously, in some of our areas here in Lucindas, Paradise Valley, North Scottsdale, Superstition area, Gold Canyon, this may be one of the challenges. You may encounter long, steep, narrow, twisting, turning, one-lane driveways. One of the crews that was at our training here had one of these incidents that occurred while we were at training here, and they discussed some of the challenges. They were able to get one engine and one ladder company up near the residence The other companies had to stage probably a quarter mile down the roadway here, which creates challenges for us. Anytime that we have setbacks like this, of this nature, first of all, we may not be able to get more than one company up there. Then we have challenges with water supply. We have challenges with deployment times as other crews arrive. And you can see that if you have crews that begin staging at this location and then work their way down the street, that it may take 5 to 10 minutes between the time you deploy them. They're able to grab their equipment and make their way up to the residence to begin either assisting with the firefighter, deploying hand lines or other things. So all those things obviously create challenges. All those things cause delays, which delays result in fire growth, and delays also result in structural member damage because time is timber. Difficulty obtaining a 360. This is always going to be a challenge when we start talking about large residential structures. Part of the challenge with it is just strictly just the building size. You've got a structure that maybe 8 or 10,000 square feet that's surrounded by fencing, pools, outbuildings, fences, barriers, animals, you name it, in addition to potential fire involvement on portions of the structure. And now these things together may limit our ability to complete a 360. Some of the things that a 360 can do for us, though, and we do need to do everything we possibly can to complete that 360, because it can help us determine the location of fire victims, the proper handline placement and resource deployment. It'll help us with interior smoke and fire conditions, identifying what those look like, potentially identify critical fire ground factors, compartmentability as we make our 360s. We determine what some of these different compartments may look like. We can identify access and entry points as we start talking later here about making access from different portions of the structure. And then also can help us identify the presence of a basement, which is a huge issue for us from a safety perspective. One of the things that Don Abbott's Mayday study found that 73% of all Maydays had a missing or incomplete 360 survey. And of those, 40% of the 360s that were performed confirmed smoke and fire in a different location that was initially presented on the front of the building. So completing that 360 is critical for our firefighters to be able to identify not only hazards, potential victims, but also identifying the location of the fire and some of the other challenges associated with it. Number 4, security and forcible entry challenges. This is a big deal for us because people with a lot of money don't want other people to try to get in and take it from them. So one of the things you're going to find is lots of security features. You may find heavy metal, wooden or glass or combination doors, heavy door frames. Once again, these aren't typically what we see in our traditional track home setting, where one firefighter in a size 12 boot, or certainly with a set of irons, can easily get into most of the front access doors, the main doors into most of these structures. When you start talking about high-end homes, when you start talking about large residential structures, a lot of times you start talking about much more customized features and much more significant security features associated with that. So you see those heavy door frames, you see roll-up shutters, especially in those residences where this may be a summer home for them, and in the wintertime they roll down all the shutters to keep the house secure. The good thing about that obviously is it keeps people out. The bad thing for us is that if we have a fire inside one of these structures, it's very difficult for our firefighters to get in, and it's also difficult for our firefighters to get out if they find themselves in trouble inside one of these structures, or us to go in and retrieve them if something goes wrong. You also may see triple pane low E glass windows here. Very hard to break, to enter or exit as well here. You see these structures that are high-end windows and stuff from an energy saving perspective, but they're very difficult to get in and out of if you have to gain access or to exit a structure. You may also find, once again, if you look at some of these security features on some of these doors, you may require circular saws or rabbet tools to gain access. Once again, a lot of these we're not going to be capable of forcing entry through these with just a set of irons. But we talk about delays. Anytime we start talking about delays, we start talking about fire growth. We start talking about time equals timber. So some of the challenges we have associated with security features and some of the forcible entry challenges for us can cause some real problems for us, and it may cause delays of 5, maybe even 10 minutes before we're able to gain access even into the structure, much less to fight the fire. Number 5, we talk about configuration and unique floor plans. These structures, when you have a lot of money to spend, there is no limit to your imagination, or the only limit is your imagination as to floor plans. So you may see structures something like this, and this is what this looks like under the roof line. But you can see, I'm sure it's a beautiful house, but very difficult for our folks to negotiate through here. In most of our situations, we're able to come in the front door and either go to the left or right where the bedrooms are, and some of our bread and butter homes here, the smaller homes, And we can pretty much identify the layout of the structure probably from the front of the building. When we start talking about these large homes, that's not the case. You can see here, there's multiple hallways coming in from this front door here, going east to west. Then you got some coming off to the sides over here. You got other hallways going different directions here, all throughout the structure here. So you have a number of different hallways going in different directions here, creating challenges for our folks, and all that in a zero visibility environment can result in disorientation for our firefighters and may increase our risk of a mayday situation. Expect the unexpected. Here's a situation when you start talking about people that have the ability to customize their homes. You can see stuff, for example, what are we going to do when somebody calls us and said we've got a firefighter that's stuck in a pond inside one of the main rooms here in the basement. People have the ability to put unusual features and fancy features in some of these homes here that we don't find in just our common everyday residential structure fires. So you can see some of these. You've got a slide down here in the bottom feature. You've got spiral staircases. All these can cause additional challenges for us as we work our way through the homes, especially when we start talking about zero visibility environment. Some of the other features you might find: home gyms. Some of these custom homes may have a gymnasium that's as big as some of the ones we have in our fire stations. The other challenge you have in them is they may have that gym built over a basement situation. So now you've got concentrated dead loads over basement areas, unsupported wide span lightweight trusses here, and the potential for failure is pretty significant. Some of the larger homes I found, this is a gym that's off of just the master bedroom. This is another wing, if you want to call it, the master bedroom, but not even a separate area for a workout area. Home offices and studies. Once again, you got a 2-story office area here that could create some challenges for us just from the fire load. Wine cellars. Once again, these are not something we typically find in our 1,500 square foot house, but not unusual when we start looking into these large custom homes. Indoor basketball courts or underground basketball courts. Once again, not unusual in the real large homes here to find things like this. You also find things like indoor shooting ranges. You can, once again, these are challenges for us. You can see things like master closets. Some of these master closets are 500 or 600 square feet by themselves, which is as big as some of the small apartments that we respond to. So you can imagine taking an incident like this, filling this closet with zero visibility smoke, and then dragging a hose line through here trying to conduct a search, how easy it would be to get disoriented, to get confused, to get stuck, especially if we're trying to move a hose line through here or get lost in something of this nature. Bowling alleys, once again, we don't typically see bowling alleys in smaller homes, but this is not unusual for larger homes. But you can see we have a significant increase in our fire load here as we start talking about bowling alleys and things like that in underground structures or other places here that we may encounter in these large homes. So the unusual floor plans, the challenges you have with some of the unique floor plans in some of these structures is they're typically not right angle, like we talked about before in some of the residential settings. So our firefighters can expect hallways will go around at different angles. You can see intersecting hallways going to different portions of the structure. Interior balconies and open staircases are very common, allowing smoke and fire spread and flow path development throughout these structures here as you start responding to large homes. Basements may have living areas, bedrooms, kitchens, bars, media rooms, saunas, exercise rooms. Once again, imagination is the limit here on some of these things. Firefighters operating in heavy smoke in these types of buildings can become disoriented very easily because of the hallways and floor levels, cavernous interiors. We need to make sure our firefighters are staying on our hose lines here. Once again, it's the #1 cause of firefighter maydays is firefighters getting off hose lines. We need to make sure they stay on them, especially in these large residential structure fires. So here's an example of the differences we talked about before. Our typical, 1,700, 1,600 square foot residential fire that we go to every day here in every one of our jurisdictions. You can see you go in the front door, you've got 3 bedrooms to the left and a bathroom. Straight ahead, you got a living room and kitchen, and to the right, you have a garage, maybe a laundry room. Now you go to the next map over here, and now you start talking about coming in the front door in some of these structures. You have hallways that go all over the place, hallways at different angles. You got hallways going to different rooms. You got over here, you can go all the way back down into this structure over here. It can create some real challenges for us as we start trying to figure out how we're going to conduct a search in some of these structures or find access to the seat of the fire. So we talk about, this is a quote that came from an article that I read about responding to large residential structure fires. It says, in simple residential occupancies, we often leave the hose line performing fireground tasks and are very successful in obtaining our tactical objectives. We say in large complex occupancies, don't leave the line. We need to finish that sentence by saying that if you do leave the line and become lost, you could die. So next thing we're going to discuss is high ceilings. High ceilings is one of those challenges that if you've been to a lot of, even in our track home fires, when we go to situations or structures that have a high ceilings or vaulted ceilings, it makes it very difficult for our firefighters to be able to gain access into some of those void spaces to try to either search for hidden fires or put out attic fires. So now we start talking about getting into these large custom homes, and it becomes even more challenging. You start talking about 20-foot plus ceilings. 10 roofs. You can see some examples in that upper right picture with 10 roofs, tongue and groove ceilings here. So you've got 3/4 inch tongue and groove ceiling that may be put over top of 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch plywood or OSB to get into that void space. The difficulty of doing that in an overhead capacity is extremely difficult. So access, we start talking about access into those void spaces, into the walls, attics, and to extinguish the fire may be a very challenging process. Once again, as we always discuss here, delays equals fire growth, time equals timber. So as you look around, you can see just the pictures we have here. I mean, you can see the challenges if you're trying to determine whether or not you have fire in the overhead, fire in the attic space, and these examples that we show here be very difficult. I mean, just to start off with, I mean, you have to decide how in the world am I going to get access into the ceiling that's just 18 or 20 feet up. So maybe you consider taking a 24-foot extension ladder to the interior, leaning against the wall. Now you got to climb that ladder and try to figure out how I'm going to poke a hole through either a tin roof, a tongue and groove ceiling, a brick fascia, or something else at that point. And so now you start talking about people using power tools potentially over their heads on the tip of a extension ladder or other type of ladder. And now you start talking about high risk situations for our firefighters that may cause injury. And once again, the ability to do that and accomplish that in a short period of time is very difficult. So we start talking about those delays, the added delays. Once again, fire growth, time is timber. Here's some other examples of some of the ceilings that you might find in some of these custom homes here. So they're very pretty, but obviously create some serious challenges for us. The other challenges you have, as you see in some of we talk about being the constructions, these residences being overbuilt. Another example you'll see is, for example, in these walls right here, you'll see what they'll do is they'll take a 2x6 wall, they'll put a 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch OSB or plywood or something like that, and then they'll do the brick fascia on that. So you can see the challenge of trying to get through, even just to get through on the back, maybe to get through that wall to get to the back of the a kitchen or a stove or something of that nature to try to check for extension could be extremely challenging. Once again, which may not be able to just gain access without power tools. And just a pickhead axe may take our folks 4 or 5 minutes just to get a 1 by 1 foot hole to gain access to try to check for extension or to fight the fire. So very difficult for us to do, much more challenging than what we typically see in our standard residential structure. So these are some challenges, and all these things that we're talking about here today can create some serious challenges for our firefighters to be able to gain access into the void spaces to be able to get water in that seat of the fire here. Attics, buildovers, roof lines, void spaces. This is another challenge. This is one of the main reasons that we lose a lot of these structures when they catch fire here. So you can see lots and lots of lumber. We talked about the thousands and thousands of board feet in these attic spaces. I've talked to a number of firefighters that have been to large residential structure fires, and they discuss some of the challenges. When they get into these attic spaces, they say it literally looks like a lumber yard. They've got maybe some of these attic spaces maybe 8 or 10 feet tall or larger. Once again, all unfinished lumber as far as the eye can see. And then you have buildovers, which we're going to discuss here in just a second. But these are a lot of challenges for us. You can see a lot of lumber. These are, small stick farms in some of these situations that we're talking about here. Buildovers. You can see this is what we're talking about when we talk about a buildover. You have situations where typically from an aesthetic perspective, they will build different roof lines and different changes and angles and different things to improve the looks from an aesthetic perspective on the structure. They're not necessarily structurally important as much as just for looks and appeal. But you can see here they built a structure where they complete a compartment that is completely enclosed, so there's no access to it from any other place. So if you get a fire that extends into a pocket like that, it may be very difficult for us to gain access into that location to extinguish that fire. We get into the main attic, we can find smoke, but we can't find the fire itself because it's confined into a small buildover or a pocket like that. You can see in this picture up here. These are some buildover locations here. Gives us numerous avenues for fire spread, difficult for us to access those hidden fires, and multiple attic spaces that may or may not be connected. It can be a challenge when we start talking about these large homes. So we start talking about buildovers. You take a look at this structure like this, and here's an example what you might find for buildovers in something like this. So you can have void spaces, you can have fire in every one of these little void spaces here. You can have individual compartmentalized attic spaces that are in each one of these squares as well here. So you can imagine trying to locate the seat of the fire, or thinking if I can just get some water up into the attic, I can put this fire out. But it's not quite so simple when you start talking about large custom homes. Some of the other challenges you find when you start talking about attic fires, once again, in most of our situations, we're able to access and put these fires out from the standpoint of maybe we access the bird boards, gable ends, we go into the interior and drop some ceiling or whatever. But when you start talking about these structures, it's much different. Not only do we have heavy fire load up there and hidden void spaces with the buildovers, but there's very, very few custom homes where you find bird boards. In a lot of these situations, you won't find gable vents because a lot of the vents will either be built into the tiles and built into the roof line itself here, or will not have any gable vents at all. High interior ceilings prevents us from going in and dropping ceiling and getting water into that attic compartment in a quick space or in a quick amount of time. And then tile roofs. Primarily, a lot of our new lightweight construction has tile roof, which obviously prevents us from getting on those roofs and operating. One of the other things that becomes a challenge for us when we start talking about large residential structures is that 150-foot interior depth limitation that we have from a volume 2 perspective. If we look at, you may have seen this chart before here, but if you look at this chart here, it discusses the amount of hose it is required to cover a certain size homes. For example, in that upper left corner there, if you have a 30-foot setback from a structure, 150 foot of hose will cover 100% of that structure when we start talking about 1,200 square feet or less. When we get to 2,400 square feet, now you're covering about 75%. When you get to that between 2,400 and 5,000 square feet, now you're covering about 35 to 50%. And then when you get into our large home, which is not necessarily a giant home, but a big home at 5,500 square feet or 5,600 square feet or bigger, now you're only talking about being able to cover 10 to 25% of the structure from one location with that 150-foot limitation. So now we're start talking about going back to the importance of that 360 survey and determining other access points where we can come in from different directions and be able to still meet that 150-foot limitation guideline to keep our firefighters safe inside these mega structures. So here's an example of what we're talking about. So this is a floor plan of a large custom home. I think it's only about 5,000 or 6,000 square feet, which is still very big, obviously, but not as big as some of these homes get. But you can see, you can imagine 150 feet won't even cover even half of this house if you start looking at it. So you can imagine somebody taking a hand line to this structure. I mean, this is not practical to think you can do this with 150 foot line coming in the front door. It's just not realistic, not practical. So this is where we're going to have to probably find ways to come in from a different location or different direction, or find other ways to gain access into the structure to be able to limit our crews with the 150-foot depth limitation into these structures. Here's another example of these structure fires here, of a structure fire in a large residential home. Once again, we got our apparatus placed out front here. Typically, you would see that we come in that front door, pull that hand line out that front door, and come up into the structure to fight the fire. Completing that 360 may give us some access to a couple of different points. You can see here, maybe this crew comes in and takes the line in from a different location here to the structure. And then finally, maybe we figure out that we got to come in from the back side over here and pull a line all the way around the back and come in from that direction. Each one has its advantages as far as just the deployment times and other things like that. But you can see here that if we look at the blue line, we're only about 40 feet into the IDLA. So if something goes wrong, our ability for our firefighters to exit the structure and get out of the structure before they run out of air have a lot better opportunity to do that than they would with either the red line, which is about 120 feet into the IDLH, or the green line, which is about 50 feet in. So as we start making those decisions from an incident commander's perspective, we have to decide which one of these is going to make more sense. Now, obviously, the red line coming off the bumper probably can be deployed and get into that location in maybe 2 minutes or less, depending on the obstructions and visibility on the interior of the structure. But they're 120 feet in, so they need to plan that obviously with their air management to be able to get out of the structure, be able to make their way to the fire, fight the fire, or do what they're going to do, and then exit the structure before they get into the final third of the bottle, which is the emergency reserve. Versus the green line, once again, which is a shorter span where it may take them a little bit less or about the same amount of time to get there, but once again, a much shorter exit path here as far as 50 feet versus 120 feet. The blue line obviously is probably our best choice from the standpoint of our ability to those firefighters to get out when they start running out of air. But the challenge is that deployment. When you start talking about the time it takes to deploy a hand line to the back of this structure, probably going to be an extended hand line or horizontal standpipe, which is probably going to be from deployment to actually get into the seat of the fire, maybe 5, even 10 minutes, depending on the crew here. So that whole time, once again, you got fire growth, time is timber, you got all those things we're talking about here today. So it can be very challenging for us. Now, maybe, and at some point in time during this firefight, it probably will be a line deployed around to that side of the structure. But just understand that there's benefits to each one and challenges to each one. Now you take this same fire and put it into a situation where it's a zero visibility environment. Now our concerns may grow a little bit there as well. So we start talking about, this line here going 120 foot through a zero visibility environment may raise some of those red flags that we're not comfortable doing here. We may find that taking the green line in here for a shorter deployment may be a little better choice, or even taking the extra time to get our line around here, so that if our crews find themselves in trouble, that they have a very short distance to safety here from being able to get out at the ideal age. Excess fire loading, this is another challenge. This is a problem we have in every fire we have, but certainly in some of our larger homes. Obviously, these large homes are filled with a lot of stuff. So we start talking about just large open spaces. The lack of compartmentation can lead to that quick spreading fires involving several rooms in a minimal amount of time. They talk about fuels in the modern furnishings that we have today have a heat release rate of 2.5 times greater than the legacy fuels that we had before and produce almost twice as much smoke. So you can see that we have these structures that are filled with lots of stuff. They burn faster, they burn hotter, they produce more smoke. All those things create challenges for us that we didn't see in the past, but become a huge challenge for us. And even more so when we start talking about large residential structure fires. The other thing you might find in some of these structures is some of these homes may have attached garage, which may hold as many as 6 vehicles or more. These folks have money. They have side-by-sides. They have, electric bikes, electric scooters. They've got fuel storage. There's a number of other things we have in these garages, large garages, which may not only either contribute to the fuel load, but also possible ignition sources when we start talking about large residential structure fires. Number 10 is basements. Basements are dangerous. We don't see a lot of basement fires. First of all, we don't go to a lot of large residential structure fires. And then of those, we don't go to a lot of those that have basements, but some do. So we're talking about some serious red flags when we start talking about large residential structure fires that have basements. So some of the things we can do, we obviously need to conduct that 360 to identify that basement as soon as possible and notify everybody on the fire ground that this home has a basement. Basement fires are extremely dangerous, extremely deadly. There was 2 incidents that occurred in the last couple of years here in large residential structure fires with basements where the firefighters fell into the basement within just a few minutes of arrival. So the fact that our folks need to be aware of not only that the structure has a basement, but that it may be involved here, especially if we can identify the fires involved in that, can improve our safety from a significant standpoint. From a basement's perspective, the UL and other people have tried to recommend that obviously if we find ourselves involved in a basement fire, we need to control that ventilation. We need to keep the fire vent limited if possible. Anything we can do to keep that fire vent limited will probably keep the fire from growing and spreading here as best we can. We also want to get water on this fire as quickly as possible, any way possible. And that means that whether through an exterior window, through the floor, down the stairs, anything we can do to try to cool those superheated gases, superheated surfaces, to reduce the possibility of flashover, try to reduce those possibility of flow paths and other things from occurring here. But we need to be very careful, obviously, and use extreme caution when we're operating above the fire. Sound as we go. We'll talk a little more about sounding here in just a minute, because unfortunately, sometimes it's not as effective as we'd like it to be. When possible, it's best to fight the basement on the same level. So one of the things that we do is we do that 360 in some of these larger custom homes. You find that they have a walkout basement. Other basements, obviously, I will typically will have just the window wells here, and we don't typically fight fires, and we don't typically fight basement fires from the window well. But if we do have a walkout basement, we would UL and everybody else strongly suggest that you fight fire from that location. So even if it means a slight delay, deploy those hand lines around to the back of the structure or whatever side that walkout basement is, and deploy lines from that level, because you're going to find it reduces the possibility, or greatly reduces the possibility, of flow paths and other challenges infecting the firefighters, like it would be if you try to go down from the first floor down a stairwell or something into that basement here, and some of the challenges associated with that, which has resulted in a number of fatalities nationwide over the last few years. Don't ventilate until you're putting water on the fire, and don't delay putting water on the fire. Coordinated attack is critical. So once again, I want to be careful about busting out a lot of windows and doing a lot of things, because obviously that creates, you take a fire from being vent limited to a fuel fed fire, creates those flow paths, increases the size of the fire and growth of the fire here. And all those things obviously just cause a deterioration of structural members, which can result in collapse and other challenges. So we want to try to keep those fires vent limited if possible, be aware of those flow paths that may occur. And then we obviously have to check for extension into the walls, void spaces, attic, and other things that we may have seen from the fire. So we talking about those flow paths. This is what we're basically talking about. Obviously, if you have a fire in the basement and you open up the door on the main floor, try to work your way down there, you're going to create a bidirectional flow path here, and our folks are going to be found in that flow path, which is extremely dangerous. Same thing you see in the bottom picture here. Basically, if you have that door open to the basement, you open that front door, you're going to create the bidirectional flow path. And any of the firefighters that are caught in that flow path, especially in that stairwell here, can find themselves in extreme danger very quickly. So we talked about sounding. Here's one of the challenges with sounding basements. You can see here it says some experts say sounding over basements, the use of thermal imaging cameras may have limited effectiveness in identifying floor stability. Multiple layers of plywood, underlayment, insulation, and thin set mortar covered by hardwood, stone, or other ceramic tiles can mask conditions and limit the firefighter's ability to determine floor integrity. So you can see an example of a high-end basement, the first floor, subfloor over a basement here. You can see here we got multiple layers of 3/4 inch tongue and groove plywood. There's three layers of that, in addition to a 3/8 inch underlayment here, followed by the subfloor, the joists, the fiberglass insulation. Then you might see 2 layers of 5/8 inch sheetrock. And then on top of all that, then we get either hardwood floors or some kind of tile or other type of surface, stone or other surface that we may see on top of that. So our ability to go into a structure and be able to sound that floor and determine whether or not it's stable and those trusses, I think is going to be very challenging. The other thing they talk about in several of the articles I've read is that when we sound a roof, we start sounding on the good portion of the roof so that we can tell when we get on the bad portion. The problem, or if we get to a point where the roof is compromised, the problem with a basement is when we come in the front door, we don't know if the very first thing we come in and touch is compromised. So we may be sounding over a bad floor to start off with. We walk in the door and we're already on a bad floor thinking this is stable. We work our way 5 or 10 feet in and fall into the basement here because the portion we started sounding on was already compromised. So that's a challenge for us. And once again, the other challenge you have, and this is a lot of articles also point this out, is the thermal imagers have limited effectiveness, even though it's the only thing we do have is thermal imaging and certainly sounding the floor, but they have limited effectiveness just once again, because of the amount of layers that we have in protection and covering those, the basement itself. It's very difficult for us to be able to read any potential heat signatures that we may have down below us to determine whether or not we have a fire below us. But once again, it's the only 2 methods we do have of trying to determine whether or not we have a basement fire. But we just need to be careful with that. Obviously, a 360 trying to identify whether we have a fire from some of those exterior perspectives, whether it be window wells or other smokes, signs of smoke and other things, might give us that idea also. And maybe even the front door, when we start talking about when we open that front door, if we have smoke floor to ceiling here that's lazy smoke, there's a good decent chance that fire may be in the basement. Maybe that's another example of the challenge that we may have, or identify that basement fire. Some other basements you can see here, just single, the one way in, one way out basement access points here with those stairwells here. You can see the fire load in some of these basements here. You can see a walkout basement example of that. So you can see basements are very difficult, very challenging for us here. You never know what you're going to find in the basements. You can see some of the examples of some of the stuff you might see in these basements. Be a real challenge for us. We don't see a lot of hoarding situations in high-end homes, but it is possible. But you can see stuff. You might see something like the train set and other things in here. Once again, you take that situation in a zero visibility environment, may be very dangerous and difficult for our folks to navigate through. One of the other things that the Mayday study found is that on average, in some of the studies they've done, it only takes 6 minutes from ignition to lightweight construction floor assembly compromise or collapse on some of the basement incidents that they've tested, versus about 19 minutes for some of the legacy construction materials that we had in the past. The Mesa Fire Department a little while back tried to do some testing and training here on the use of getting water down into our basement window wells here. And you can see a couple of examples here. You can see they took a fog nozzle and just pushed it down into a window well in the upper two portions of the windows here. And then you can see the bottom right is a penetrating nozzle that they put down in here. And you can see some of the water application rates here. I'll give you an example of just some of the amount of water we can get down to the basement. UL talks about any water we can get down there will improve the conditions on the basement. So here's some examples of those. We'll show you those real quick here. So you can see they can get a significant amount of water down through the window wells here with just a couple of those options here. UL and some of their training, they showed just putting a straight stream through a small hole cut in the floor or chopped in the floor here. You can see a fog nozzle, a fog stream pushed down through there, a piercing nozzle pushed through the floor here to give some examples of some ways we can get that introduced water into that basement. But anything we can do is going to improve the basement conditions and improve our opportunities for us to potentially control that the fire that's maybe extending in the basement itself. So one of the reasons basements are so dangerous is we don't always identify which structures have those basements. So we need to make sure we do that 360 here, because we don't want to find out that we have a basement after we've already entered a structure here and we find out we may be working over the fire. A lot of times it's limited access, one way in, one way out, other than the window wells. We don't make access into those structures typically from that location. Flow paths are predictable, but can be hard to control. So if we go in that front door and we try to work our way down that basement that is open, an open floor plan, that fire and the flow path will obviously be coming straight up and out of that stairwell. We can control that front door. If we can control the front door here and limit that flow path here, we can potentially cut that off a little bit, but may still be a challenge for us here. Our firefighters may be working over unchecked fire. Anytime we're working over fire, it's more dangerous, obviously, than when we're not. We talked about tick surveys may be misleading. Sound in the floors may be ineffective. It may be difficult to find the interior stairwell in limited visibility situations. If we come in the front door and we have a zero visibility environment, it may be difficult for us to find that stairwell. I know I've been in residences with basements where they had a door that looked like any other door in the kitchen or any place else that opened that door and got you down into the basement. So if you're in a limited visibility environment, you may go through the whole first floor and not be able to figure out which one of those doors or which one of those areas gets you into the basement. So it could be a challenge for us. Once again, in most of the articles I read, we typically firefighters should not enter window wells to fight fire. Now we may have to enter window wells to conduct a search if we have a known rescue, or to remove a victim if you have someone in there, or if you have a Mayday situation with a firefighter, it may be an option for us to gain access and try to remove somebody from that location. But as far as just conducting a firefighting operation, I would recommend against it. Obviously, it's a case-by-case basis, but just understand there's been a number of firefighter-related fatalities associated with basements. So we need to be very careful about that. You can see here's a couple of examples. Both the pictures here are examples of line of duty death situations where firefighters have fallen into the basement here as a result of that. Next thing we move on to, we start talking about small versus large residential mentality. And this is one of those where sometimes it's easy for us to pull up and see it's a residence and kind of think the same way we do when we pull up to a 1,700 square foot residential tract home structure. And there's a lot of differences in some of these things we talk about here. We talk about the threshold reports. Once again, we have a little bit of, sometimes we have a little bit of flexibility and a little bit of a safe zone, if you want to call it that, when we start talking about smaller residential structures, because our ability to get in and out if things go wrong may be a little bit easier for us. But when we start talking about large residential structures, once again, once we cross that threshold, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of places that our folks can get lost or get into trouble here. So those threshold reports and PCAN reports are critical for our incident commanders. So we need to make sure that we ask for those reports and drive them if we need to get additional information so we can find out what is going on inside these large structures here to be able to support them, to be able to recover them, retrieve them if something goes wrong here, and to be able to manage the accountability for our members here. Understand that large open floor plans, wide unsupported truss spans under tile roofs are a risk for early collapse. We have these large rooms. We have some of these great rooms, maybe 50 by 50 or larger. Unsupported trusses, open parallel cord trusses that we may have where fire may extend through those things. And then once again, on top of some of these things, we may find tile roof, which once again, that fire loading may result in early collapse if we're not aware of our situation and don't gain access and determine whether or not we have fire extension into the attic space. Fire attack may require entry from multiple sides. Once again, that's typically not a challenge for us when we have smaller residential structures, but in these situations, once again, to maintain that 150-foot limitation, we may have to gain access from multiple sides. These structures are often the same size as small commercial buildings, but without the same sprinkler and fire stop requirements in the void spaces. So that's one of the things we probably ought to consider is we're basically fighting fire in basically as a small commercial structure in a lot of these situations. And our mindset would be much different if we pulled up on these situations and it was a commercial building, but for some reason we don't. We take that residential mentality into these large structures. We need to be very careful doing so. Attacking the fire with large hand lines, 2.5 should be considered. This is one of those things we talk about, that reach, volume, and penetration that we can get from the 2.5-inch hand line may be very important for our firefighters. It gives us that ability to maybe limit the depth of our hose line deployment into some of these structures here and being able to reach out a little bit further, get a little better knockdown when we start talking about these high or heavy fuel loads here in these structures. So a 2.5 should be considered. We may take that 1 3/4 initially here, but maybe back it up with a 2.5 should be a consideration. Setbacks and access limitations result in significant transit times for deployments. Once again, when you start talking about that, whether it just be the setbacks, you may have a 50-foot setback, 100-foot setback. So not only do we have time deployment there as far as just deploying it a little bit further than we normally do, but now we're talking about having to extend hand line. We're talking about horizontal standpipes for those agencies that use those. But in each one of those situations, it's not something that we do on a regular basis. So once again, now we're having a situation where it's taking us another 2, 3, 4 minutes to get that same hand line into that same place. Which results in, once again, fire delays, fire growth, and those other things that we discussed before. So we may you have to consider that deployment time. So as we start talking about deploying another hand line, just once again, you need to start thinking that it may take you between the time you give the order and that time that hand line gets in place and that water gets on to that area, or that hand line gets deployed to the area you're looking for, being 5 minutes or longer, depending on where the truck's coming from, whether they're staged on deck or whether they're coming from a distance down the street. Ladder companies also may be a challenge. They may have to haul equipment further and farther than they would otherwise. So you may have a situation where, once again, the closest that ladder truck was able to get is several hundred yards down the street. So between the time you deploy them and the time that they're able to move ladders and saws and everything else up to the structure, or maybe to make a vertical ventilation on a flat portion of the roof or something like that, may take 4 to 5 or 6 minutes. Whereas if obviously if that ladder truck is parked close to the front of a smaller residential structure, may only take them 2 or 3 minutes. So once again, time is timber, and all those things we need to consider when we do those type of situations. Here's an example of some of those large unsupported truss spaces here that we start talking about large custom rooms that we don't typically see in our small residential structures. Difficulty conducting or completing a primary search. So this is something, obviously our primary focus is life safety. So we need to be concerned about this, but it's going to create some real challenges for us when we start talking about large residential structures. Anytime we go to a residential fire and we are able to make contact with the resident, we want to try to see if we can get that resident reported all clear. Now, it's once again, it's always one of those trust but verify things. But we need to see if the owner or the occupant can tell us whether or not they know that everybody's out of the structure. One of the challenges is, can we believe what they tell you? Is the report reliable? If they're trapped occupants, can we determine how many of their location and use that information to move more quickly to that location to get to them? But also keep in mind that we don't want to bypass fire to get to victims. We don't want to just, in an effort to try to rescue victims, we don't want to take that handline and bypass active fire here, because what we may find is by the time we get to the victim, that fire may extend. We may get flashover conditions or something of that nature. So we need to do whatever we can to keep that fire in check while we're trying to gain access into those victims. So once again, the problem, or one of the challenges I guess we might consider in large residential structure fires versus smaller ones, is that when we start talking about structure fires structures that are 5 or 6 or 10,000 square feet, they may have other people living with them, other people staying with them. They may have people that are working for them that live there, maids or other folks that may be staff that may be living in the structure. So when you ask for a resident report at all clear, we need to make sure they talk about all the people that may be there, including visitors or guests or workers as well, when we start talking about these size of structures. So if we do conduct a search, we need to start with the last known location. If we have a resident reported all clear, we want to make sure we determine that last known location, and we want to start at that location if at all possible, because once again, doing a right wall search in a 10,000 square foot structure is not practical, not possible. And most of it may be possible, but certainly not something that's going to occur very quickly. So we want to start with that last known location. If we can do a targeted search, get units to that location as quickly as possible to conduct a search of that area. Then obviously we want to check around the area of the firefighter around the fire and directly above the fire, because those are our most severely threatened areas. Then the remainder of the house. Now, obviously, if we have a situation where we have where you pull up and somebody says, my grandfather is in that room right there and he has not come out yet, well, obviously we can consider that enter isolate search situation, where we're going to gain, instead of maybe working our way down to a zero visibility, high heat environment, 120 feet into the structure, we may gain access into that room itself through the window, get inside, close the door, and isolate that room here, conduct that search, hopefully protected by a handline from the exterior window, conduct that search, and if we find that victim, remove that victim from that location. So if you have a known or suspected victim, command should drive and support the search. Obviously, we want to make sure that we continue to support that search with additional companies and continue to check for progress, get those progress reports as we try to identify either a known or suspected victim. So here's what I talked about before. So if you have a situation where you have a known victim, as you can see down here in this corner of the structure here, I'm not sure that it makes a ton of sense for us to come in the front door here, work our way down through all this fire and smoke, and then to take the victim back out through that same location. That's just certain out examples. This is not our first choice here. What probably would be a better choice for us, obviously, would be that VEIS we talked about before here. Excuse me. So some of the search and rescue challenges that are different on large residential structures versus small, or either our small multifamily or other type of residential structures, is numerous sleeping areas. And this is unusual for even some tract homes that have a split floor plan. But when you're talking about these large residential structures, if you tell somebody, hey, let's go search the bedrooms, it may not be as simple. You may go to the master bedroom, and now that master bedroom may be 1,200 square feet or larger. And then they may have sitting areas. They may have gyms and saunas coming off of that area. They may have huge walk-in closets, 400 or 500 square foot walk-in closets, just in the master bedroom alone. So trying to search a master bedroom for victims may be similar to searching a small residential structure. And then you go, well, let's check the kids. Well, the kids' rooms may be separate from the parents. They may be, well, obviously they'll be separate probably from the parents, but they may be on different floors and different wings of the house, in the basement. So there's a number of ways you may once again, in an effort to try to conduct a search of the sleeping areas, you may end up having to go through 3 or 4 different areas here, different wings of the house, on different floors of the house. So much more complicated to get that primary all clear on a residential structure from, even if you're just trying to check for the sleeping areas, and maybe in an incident where we respond to a large house fire in the middle of the night here and you suspect possible victims. The other challenge you have in some of these structures is mother-in-law suites, or suites for some of their in-house workers here, assistants they may have. So that may be another challenge. So you may have to look at those wings, different wings of the house, and try to see if there's additional people in those locations as well. So what we probably will find is, well, in most situations, when you start talking about conducting a search on a very large residential structure, it's very similar to what we talk about with the commercial structure. Unless we have a known rescue or a targeted rescue, a lot of times you're going to have a situation where basically crews are going to search the areas where they are working and passing through. So it's not as simple as it's just going to be. It's not going to be just necessarily a situation where we're going to just conduct a right or left wall search. We're basically going to go toward the seat of the fire and we'll search as we go. And so just like we have with a commercial structure, a lot of times that search and rescue will be an action of opportunity. It's basically we're going to be conducting that search, and if we come across somebody or we hear somebody, or as we work our way through the residence, if we find them, obviously we'll remove them. So this is a 5,000 square foot home basically, but you can see the challenge of trying to do a right wall search in this structure. This is not something that's going to take a 3 or 4 minutes, and this is without any obstruction. So you can imagine zero visibility with obstructions. This is not necessarily realistic unless you have a known rescue. If we have a situation where somebody says, hey, there's somebody in the house, well, this is what we're going to have to do at some point in time. We may have multiple crews coming in, going different directions even from multiple entries maybe to try to complete that search. But just understand it's going to be very complicated, time consuming, and may require multiple crews and be very dangerous for us as well. So we start talking about complex roofs and ventilation. This is another challenge we have when we start talking about large residential structures. So we have to decide, should we vent? Is vertical ventilation indicated? If so, it must be coordinated with obviously with the interior crews locating and getting water on the seat of the fire, not having active fire in the attic. This is a real challenge for us. So we have to determine that risk versus benefit. This is not a simple thing when we start talking about large residential structures. We may have to just consider, see if our folks, can do some hydraulic ventilation or something of that nature. We may end up having to do some PPV at some point in time when it's indicated, but just very difficult sometimes for us to do commercial. I'm not saying commercial. I'm sorry. For us to do vertical ventilation. So here's an example of that. If we go to the house of either one of these houses here and somebody says, hey, interior crew says I need vertical ventilation, where are you going to tell them to cut? Now, there are some areas that are flat so that we can maybe conduct that vertical ventilation, but where are we going to cut? We have to determine where they're located. How easy is that going to be when somebody disappears in that front door and they're 120 feet inside the structure and they're saying, I need vertical ventilation. Where do I even cut? So that's one of the first challenges you have. And then can we cut? Obviously, do it depend on what roof coverage and other things we have to decide. Do we have tile roof, which we don't typically cut on? Metal roofs we can cut, but we don't do it very often. So that could be some challenges for us. Shake or metal shingles. We don't typically cut shake shingle roofs. Metal shingles probably is something we could do, but we don't see very often. And then we may see an asphalt shingle, but we don't see that. We rarely are probably going to see asphalt shingles on a large custom home just because that's typically not what you're going to see here. But that certainly would be an option in that situation, but can we cut's going to be a challenge. The other thing that probably is going to be a challenge is going to be the offsets and the setbacks. So once again, our ability to get a ladder truck in there or get ladders, portable ground ladders in there is going to take some time. And then we have to decide whether or not we have a flat portion of the roof where we can work. And so that may create some challenges for us, may create some difficulties on us gaining access, conducting that vertical ventilation as necessary here. Then we got buildovers, numerous roof ventilation or roof elevations, changes in pitches. So there's a lot of complications and challenges with us trying to get that vertical ventilation. But there may be times it may be indicated if we can figure out where they're at and stuff, maybe we can consider vertical ventilation. Another thing we might want to consider in some of these houses where we have multiple wings is a trench cut. See if there's an area we could cut off a portion of this structure when we have that attic involvement or other extension of these structures, or maybe we can cut off and save a portion of the building. So that may be another challenge for us. And then can we work off the platform or ladder? Is there a situation where we can get the ladder close enough where we can work off of it in a tile roof situation or something, maybe an option for us? Number 14, we talk about air management. This is one of those things that's going to be a challenge for us. We start talking about this, just like when we talk about and discuss response to commercial fires and our crews that are involved in managing an incident inside of a commercial structure. This is almost the same situation. So we need to be very careful due to the size and configuration of these structures. We can become easily disoriented in limited visibility environments. We need to be very careful with our air management. We need to make sure that our sector officers and our company officers are making sure they're micromanaging the errors of our individuals that are involved, because once again, there's no difference between being 150 feet inside of a residential structure versus 150 feet inside a commercial building. Same thing, if you're disoriented, you can get lost and have difficulty in getting out of the structure before you run out of air. So we want to make sure that we do everything we can to try to reduce the possibility of a mayday situation. Understand we have a third of our air to enter, which is our work cycle, a third to exit, and a third for emergency reserve. We should not allow firefighters to operate in an IDLH with their viber alerts or bells ringing. So we need to make sure they're out of the structure by then. We need to monitor their air management so that we can get crews started their direction, get them out before the bells start ringing or their viber alerts go off. Phoenix Fire did some research here on a drill that they had, and they found that on average, firefighters consume about 255 PSI per minute of air during their training evolution while they're working. So if you do the math, 4,500 PSI, you got 1,500 PSI for emergency reserve, you got 3,000 pounds of work. You're talking about maybe the operating time on the interior of the structure, 12 minutes total. So that may be the amount of time between going into the structure, conducting our operations, and then exiting the structure before that bell rings here. So that's not much time, especially when you start talking about large residential structure. So this may be something where, once again, it's beneficial for us to come in from different directions so that we can get to the area we're working in maybe within 2 or 3 minutes. It gives us that 6 or 8 minutes to work, and then our ability to come out before we run out of air. So just something for us to consider as the incident commander. Next thing we're going to talk about is visual acuity and incident command. This can be a challenge for us when we start talking about large residential construction and structure fires. Sometimes because of setbacks and other things that may come into play, but you can find that you may pull up on a situation, and this is what may happen. You get that perfect situation, you got that perfect location, and then the ladder truck pulls in or an engine company pulls in and blocks your view. So we need to be careful. We need to understand that, but it's very important for us to understand visual acuity is very important for our incident commanders. Our ability to see what's taking place here, to see whether or not conditions are improving, conditions are deteriorating. We have the ability to see, potential fire travel as far as through the structure. We can see whether water's getting on the seat of the fire. We can see a lot of those things can take place if we have the ability to visually see what's taking place on these large structure fires. So it's important for us to have access and visual acuity. So there's a couple things we can do. If our view is blocked, can we reposition the battalion to a better location, maybe where we can see at least a partial view here, and maybe see enough where we're comfortable that we can see enough of what's taking place here, so that if conditions deteriorate, we can rapidly make changes to the strategy if necessary. We can also move to the cab of a 4 unit. This is an incident that occurred in Mesa a little while back, where the battalion had a great view of the incident right up to the point where the ladder truck moved in and parked. And we know we try to leave the ladder, the front of the building for the ladder, and we know that. So sometimes it's probably our fault when we take our battalion positioning or incident command location here, and we put it in an area that obviously an engine or another company is probably going to block at some point in time. But for us, in this situation, what they did, they just moved to the cab of the engine company in front of the house or the ladder truck. We can work out of the incident. We can run our incident command out of the cab of an engine or ladder just as easy as we can a battalion. Now, may not be our typical office space. It may not be our typical area, the location that we work out of, but certainly the engines or ladders have the ability to get headsets. We can take our clipboard. We can just notify the alarm when that command is now running out of the cab of engine 211. We can hit the taking command button on the MCT, and all of our messages will come here just like they did on the battalion. So that's another option for us. But I would tell you, instead of sitting behind a ladder truck, not being able to see what's taking place, or an engine company or whatever else it is, I would tell you, you're much better off from a firefighter safety perspective, moving to the cab or moving to a different location where you can see what's going on. Now, in some of our incidents, we may have the option to move into the command van. So if they get there relatively soon, they're able to put up their mass camera. And in some situations, they obviously have the ability to see their residents at least as much, if not more than what you can see from the battalion. That may be a great option for us, obviously, for us to consider. But just I would just tell you, don't operate in a situation where you cannot see the effectiveness of the attack on the fire itself, and some of the safety concerns that may be associated with anything from either where our firefighters are operating or how they're operating, or other things that we may not be able to see parked behind an engine or ladder. So here's another example. We talked about this setbacks here. Probably not a great position for us to be parked out here on the street trying to run an incident. Might as well run it from the station if we're going to do this, because you're not going to be able to see what's taking place. You're probably not have a good idea what's going on until somebody keys the mic and tells you, which may take 4 or 5 minutes or even longer for somebody to let you know what's going on when they think you may be aware of that situation occurring already. So we talk about risk management plan, fire ground strategy. Obviously, this is something we do right from the start of the incident, but we have to decide whether we're going to be offensive or defensive, and then we're going to decide, how long we're going to go in and stay in, or whether we're going to come out and stay out. So it just depends on what we're going to do here. But throughout the event, obviously, we want to challenge the strategy, challenge the plan between the incident commander and the BSO and the senior advisor if necessary here. But once again, we'll make sure we're always operating in the correct strategy. We want to sectorize early and often if we can. We want that ability to create that tactical layering. If we have a situation where we have crews coming in from different sides, send those BCs forward if you have the ability to do that. Start creating that tactical layering. Assign 3 units to them. We got that working unit, on deck units, and the refresh units here, replenish units. If we have the ability to do that, that's fantastic, especially if we have the command band on the scene. Because what it does is give us that BC in that sector, and gives us that built-in safety sector as well, and that back channel, safety back channel that we can utilize for accountability and other things here. So if we have the ability to do that in the incidents where we've got enough resources on the scene to do that, certainly a consideration for us. But early sectorization is critical for our folks. So what are the predictable sectors? So here's some examples of predictable sectors on residents of this size. Interior sector initially might be what we use. Roof sector probably be something to consider if we have any flat portions of the roof. On deck with rescue responsibilities may be a consideration. Ventilation sector, if they don't go to the roof, that may be an option for us here. And depending on the size of the structure, we may end up doing a north sector or something if we have other hand lines being deployed from different portions of the structure. South sector, if we determine we're going to go and create sectors from both different portions of the structure, I would certainly recommend obviously going with the north and south sector versus just an interior and a north sector to eliminate confusion here. Then maybe an occupant services sector might be something to consider here. Large residents of this size, maybe you might see something that might start off with a sector 1, sector 2, maybe a roof sector if there's a flat portion of the roof. On deck with rescue responsibilities. Ventilation sector at some point in time, probably. You may create a north sector if you want to get hand lines in from the back side of the structure. South sector if you bring in lines in from this side. Occupant services sector, potentially. That's just some things to consider here. But these are just some ideas of what some of the predictable sectors might be on these large residential structure fires. So some other large house fire stuff here to consider here. These are just some examples of this. Just remember, if you get dispatched to a residential structure fire and you either are familiar with the area, or you look at your MCT in the map, or you'll see other indications that this is going to be a large residential structure. And once again, it's probably going to be 3,000 plus square feet or 4,000 plus square feet. And you have smoke showing where you've got an active working fire, or you've got multiple reports of a working fire. I would strongly suggest going to a first alarm, because you're going to need every bit of those resources to try to manage a working fire in a structure fire that's greater than 3,500 square feet. Now, we talked about this before. A lot of Circle Ks and things like that are typically about 3,500, 4,000 square feet. If we had a working fire on one of those, we'd go to a first alarm in a second, wouldn't think about anything about it because it's a commercial structure. Well, I would tell you to do the same thing here. If you have a large residential structure and you have signs of working fire, upgrade to a first alarm en route. Supply lines. This is one of those things I would strongly recommend our folks lay supply lines coming into these things. You have situations, and this is going to be a judgment call, obviously, because in certain situations, if we talk about those limited entry curved driveways going up on some of these mountain areas, it may make more sense for the first company to come in with just tank water, depending on the size of the structure fire. Have the second company come in, or the ladder company come in next if they're coming in arriving, and then maybe have the second company come in and lay a supply line to them. If that makes sense, every situation is going to be different, but I would tell you want to make sure that you get those supply lines coming in early and often, so we have the ability to get those hand lines in place and deploy hand lines quickly. even from different locations on that structure fire. So it may make sense to lay supply lines in from two different directions, so that one can take a line around to the back of the structure, maybe from a little shorter perspective, if there's a area or angle that they can do that. And other hand lines may come in from the front or a different location. So strongly consider getting a minimum one hand line or one supply line as quickly as possible, and follow with a second supply line as necessary. Remember, things get better with a supply line. Fire ground factors, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but obviously you can see on large residential structure fires, these factors are all come into play here at different times during that fire building construction. We've already talked about overbuilding, occupancy. You may find some of these large residential structures as group homes. You can see that. I know that there's a situation in several of those homes that way in Northeast Mesa. Arrangement exposure, we don't see a lot of exposure. We'll talk about that in a minute here with some of these structures that we do with maybe some of the smaller tract homes situations. Fire and smoke conditions can be anything from light smoke to fully involved. Obviously, we know that. Life hazards, we may find people inside these structures that may be difficult to locate them. Resources, get the resources started early. Once again, if you have a 13,000 square foot home that's well involved, got to go to a second. I would hope you would go to a second, because we would on a commercial building that size, and you're going to need everybody those resources to do that. And then actions, obviously, and circumstances will come into play there. Fire attack considerations. Once again, when most of our small tract home residential structure fires, we don't typically think about a cutoff portion, because typically the whole, if the main living room is involved, for the most part, the house is involved, versus some of these larger homes where you may have a wing of the structure that's involved. So we may have to start thinking about, can we cut off a portion of the structure? Can we save a portion of the structure? We may have to look at cutoff points. So you can look at this structure here. You can see that maybe there's some cutoff points, and if we can try to identify those and relay that message to the interior crews and to ladder crews on the roof, maybe as to where that location is, we may have an opportunity to cut off and save a portion or a wing of this house. Fire attack may have to come in from all four sides, depending on the size of these homes, which is not typical for our smaller homes. We talked about considering those 2.5-inch hand lines for each volume of penetrations in some of our situations due to fire load or configuration or other things that we may need that additional water here. We need to remember, obviously, large building makes large fires, and command must maintain an appropriate tactical reserve. And this is one of those we need to be careful, because we would go to in the same situation with the commercial building of that same size. A lot of times we'd keep it 2-in-1 and maybe in reserve at all times here while we're managing that fire. But we'll go to that same structure fire in a residential structure, same size building, and we'll have one engine on deck and maybe one in staging. We need to be careful about that. I would tell you to make sure you have an appropriate level of tactical reserve units on site and ready to be deployed if we're working and managing an active fire in a large structure of this nature. Sometimes we have to be creative. This is an incident with a large residential structure fire, and you can see crews are operating on a safe portion of an uninvolved portion of the building, and they're gaining access into the attic space. So sometimes we have to get creative on our attic, on our fire attack, when we start talking about these large structures, more so than maybe a standard residential fire. On deck with rescue responsibilities. This is one of those things, we try to deploy it as soon as we can or when we think it's appropriate, and I would tell you to do so. Once again, these fires are very dangerous, high risk, low frequency events. So if we have the ability to deploy a on deck with rescue responsibility crew, I would tell you to do so. If we're going to be taking lines in from different portions of the structure, I would tell you to try to get an on deck with rescue responsibilities company in each sector. In some situations, if we have the ability, or we have a situation where we have that 3D layering, obviously one of those companies can be utilized as that rescue company if necessary. But I would tell you that if you're going to do that, we need to make sure we get the RIC SCBA and tool bag to each one of those sectors, obviously, in case something goes wrong. Exposures, we mentioned those a few minutes ago. We don't typically have a lot of exposure problem with these large residential structures, primarily because they're on large lots separating each other. So unless it's really windy or something else is unusual about it, there's typically enough setbacks and other separation between homes where it's typically not a problem for us. But a lot of the exposure we're going to probably find on these structures is going to be the outbuildings. So stuff like casitas and garages and things like that may be the exposures we have more so than other residences around them. The other incident we need to be careful about is obviously a lot of these homes are located in the deserts and that urban interface here, where if we have may have a situation, especially if we have wind blowing or something, where we may have to be careful about desert vegetation and exposure and extension into the other surrounding, either the desert itself or into other houses around it there. We have to be careful about that. And we can obviously identify those exposures during our 360. Accountability can be a challenge for us. Just once again, as we talked about before, just because of the size of these structures, as those crews disappear into a zero visibility environment and they're 100 feet down a hose line, it's very difficult sometimes for a sector officer to have true accountability for our folks. We need to make sure we keep our crews on their hand lines, staying together, entering and exiting together here. But understand direct supervision is going to be difficult, but we need to do everything we can to try to have accountability for those folks. Making sure they're staying on those hand lines because of the potential for disorientation, making sure we're getting those PARs and pecans often so we can keep track of our folks and know where they're at and that they're safe and that we send additional crews in to replace them before they run out of air. Customer service. This is what separates us out as far as being professionals. We just need to make sure that we do what we need to in salvage and from a salvage and overhaul perspective to try to protect people's their possessions here. Obviously, they're no more important than the 1,200 square foot or 600 square foot apartment. Their possessions aren't any more important. But just understand the fire loss can be. I know that I've been to a number of incidents that have occurred either on Camelback Mountain or other places here, and the owner, would basically tell you, hey, look, I don't care if the whole house burns down, just save my car. I just spent $3 million for that car at the Barrett-Jackson auction. So sometimes it may be something where we have the ability to remove a painting or something of that nature that we may not think is valuable, but the occupant does here in an effort to reduce not only fire loss, but obviously to maybe replace something that's irreplaceable here or to remove something that's irreplaceable. So just something to consider here as we start talking about these high-end homes and the values of some of these things here. You can see just, obviously some of this stuff is pretty valuable. This next incident, I'm just going to show you a few minutes of it here, but this is an incident that occurred way back in 1999 in Gilbert, but it's a 5,000 square foot home that got struck by lightning. And you can see here, it's a little blurry to start off with, but they'll clean the windshield and you'll be able to see it here. But you can see it's a 5,000 square foot structure with a tile roof, was struck by lightning. There's a crew in the attic that's trying to locate the seat of the fire. I talked to some of those crew members and they said basically the attic looked like a lumberyard. They said it was a huge attic space. It was like 10 feet tall. They had smoke in the attic. They worked for probably 20 minutes trying to locate the source of the smoke. They could not find it. It was basically in a built over area that they didn't have access into. In the main portion of the attic, they could not get access into that portion or see where that fire was coming from. But you can see, we'll watch just a minute or two of it. You can see how quickly this fire, once it busts through the tile, how quickly things deteriorate and how quickly these fires could go wrong if we're not careful. You can see the fire starting to break through the tile roof here at this point. And you can see now the fire continues to grow here. So you can see here, obviously, this is a large home, but now you've got fire through the roof. Cruz talked about basically they started getting tile starting to rain down on them as they were exiting the structure. You can see here they went defensive here, and not a moment too soon. This is one that they had fire in the attic space, a hidden fire. They were unable to gain access into that portion of the structure, the hidden void space here to get water on the seat of the fire. It ended up being a defensive operation. So not unusual for us, but we need to certainly recognize that and get out sooner versus later. So you can see, here's some examples of some fires that have occurred in really large homes across the country here, and you can see the results. Not unusual. Once these fires get started here, once they get deep seated into some of these void spaces, very difficult for our firefighters to put them out. In a lot of these situations, obviously, they go defensive here. So don't get in the way of outcomes we cannot change. So in conclusion, responding to fires in very large structures is a very rare and presents unique challenges for us here. The ceilings are higher, the rooms are bigger, filled with more obstacles. Time deployment is to increase, communications and accountability suffers, and the likeliness for a firefighter fatigue and disorientation is great. So understanding how these homes are constructed, the avenues of fire spread, awareness of the critical fire ground factors, proper implementation of tactics and strategy can help us lead to better and safer outcomes in these type of events. So just understand that it's not just a house fire. These response to large residential structure fires is different and much more dangerous, much more requires much greater resources and different firefighting tactics than we do on smaller residential structures. So thank you for your participation today. If you have any questions, you can see here you can contact me or your battalion chief for additional information. You can see here's a couple of the articles that we're able to get some information for this program. So thank you for your participation. Be safe out there, and we will see you soon.